The sun hangs low over the rolling hills of rural Iowa, casting long, amber shadows across the endless rows of corn that sway gently in the evening breeze. This is the golden hour, a time when the earth seems to breathe in the warmth of the day before the cool of the prairie night takes over. For generations, this horizon represented more than just a beautiful view, it was a promise of continuity, a cycle of planting and harvest that bound families to the soil they walked upon. But lately, the light feels different, as if the very air is thinning out. The familiar rhythmic hum of the cicadas is now punctuated by a silence that wasn't there before, a quiet, unsettling transition that is slowly rewriting the map of the American heartland. Elias stands at the edge of his property, his heavy boots caked in the dark. Rich earth that his grandfather first broke with a horse-drawn plow nearly a century ago. At 65, his face is a detailed roadmap of seasons spent under a relentless sun, etched with the deep lines of a man who has weathered both extreme drought and devastating flood. He oversees 500 acres of some of the most fertile ground on the planet, a legacy he desperately intends to pass to his son, Caleb. Yet, the numbers on the ledger at the kitchen table tell a much harsher story. Rising costs of fertilizer, equipment repairs that feel like a king's ransom, and the fluctuating prices of grain have squeezed his margins to the point of total suffocation. Every year, the weight of the mortgage feels heavier, acting like a silent predator stalking the perimeter of his life. A few weeks ago, the first sign of a changing world appeared on the Miller farm just to the east. It wasn't the usual local realtor's logo Elias had seen for decades. It was a stark black and white sign that simply said, "Sold." There had been no public auction, no rumors at the local diner about the Millers moving to a retirement home. They were just gone, their house dark and their equipment sold off in the middle of the night. When Elias drove past the property the following morning, he saw a team of men in unmarked white trucks surveying the land, their high-tech digital sensors looking wildly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the old wooden silos. Curiosity turned to deep concern when he checked the public records. The buyer wasn't a neighboring family looking to expand. It was a mysterious entity called Horizon Holdings LLC, registered to a nondescript office in Delaware. Slowly, the community began to fracture in ways Elias couldn't have imagined. One by one, the familiar tractors stopped running on the adjacent plots. The people Elias had known since childhood, men he had shared beer with at county fairs, and women who had brought pies to his house after his wife's funeral, were vanishing without a word. In their place came land managers, corporate employees who didn't live in the town and didn't care about the local high school's football scores. They spoke in cold terms of asset optimization and yield projections rather than weather and kinship. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The town was becoming a collection of ghost estates, managed by shadows from a distant city. Elias, driven by a growing sense of dread, spent his late nights huddled over his son's laptop. Caleb, who possessed a natural knack for navigating the digital shadows that Elias couldn't understand, began peeling back the layers of these shell companies. It was a complex labyrinth of paperwork designed specifically to obscure the truth. Behind Horizon Holdings was another firm, and behind that, a private equity group. Eventually, the trail led to a single name that resonated from the glass towers of Silicon Valley: Marcus Thorne. Thorne wasn't a farmer, and he certainly wasn't interested in the heritage of the Midwest. He was a visionary tech billionaire who viewed the world as a series of data points to be harvested. To Thorne, the soil wasn't a home. It was a strategic hedge, a tangible asset in an increasingly digital and volatile world. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing neighbors, he was being surrounded by a modern-day empire. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the cooling air began to bite, Elias walked to his mailbox at the end of the long gravel drive. Inside, among the bills and farm circulars, was a plain manila envelope with no return address. His hand shook slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a high-resolution satellite map of the entire county. Most of the plots were shaded in a cold corporate blue, marking the recent acquisitions of Thorne's LLCs. But right in the center sat his 500 acres, untouched and vivid green. Around his property, someone had drawn a thick, aggressive circle in red ink. At the bottom of the page, a single typed sentence chilled him to the bone. The final piece of the puzzle. The hunt for the American dream had turned into a hunt for his very soul. Marcus Thorne did not see the world through the lens of seasons, cycles, or the humble hope of a harvest. To him, the globe was a complex digital grid, and the American Midwest was a series of undervalued coordinates on a shifting map. He sat in his glass sanctuary high above San Francisco, a place of minimalist steel and silent power. Thorne's philosophy was as cold as the glass surrounding him. In an era where digital currencies could fluctuate and data could be corrupted, true power lay in fundamental elements. He often told his inner circle that while data was temporary, the soil was eternal. He wasn't merely an investor in agriculture, he was the architect of a new feudalism, one where the lords were tech moguls and the land was the ultimate asset. Thorne's strategy for acquisition was one of surgical precision. He didn't rely on simple offers that a proud man like Elias could refuse. Instead, his investment firm, Thorne Capital, moved like a silent virus through the local infrastructure. They used predatory lending, buying up the distressed debt of small local banks that had supported these farming communities for generations. Once they held the paper, they could manipulate the terms, squeezing families until they broke. Beyond the banks, Thorne pressured county assessors. By paying inflated prices for key properties, his shell companies artificially drove up the market value of the entire county. For Elias, this meant his property taxes were suddenly calculated as if his farm were a luxury estate rather than a working business. It was a calculated economic stranglehold designed to make the cost of staying far higher than the cost of leaving. This invisible war seeped through the floorboards of Elias's farmhouse, creating a heavy atmosphere of desperation. His son, Caleb, lived in a state of digital anxiety, eyes tired from tracking dwindling bank balances on his phone late into the night. Caleb represented the new generation, one that had seen the struggle and wondered if the reward was worth the sacrifice. He carried heavy student loans and equipment debt, and to him, the land was no longer a legacy. It was a sinking ship. A deep emotional rift formed between father and son, manifesting in sharp silences and heated arguments. Caleb argued that the mysterious buyers were offering a lifeline to settle their debts and move toward a different future. He couldn't understand his father's stubborn attachment to a patch of dirt. Elias, meanwhile, saw his son's willingness to sell as a betrayal of their ancestors' legacy. As the economic pressure mounted, Elias spent his few free hours digging through old records at the county courthouse, searching for any legal leverage he might have left. There, amidst the smell of decaying paper and ink, he discovered a hidden truth. He found a misplaced environmental report filed by one of Thorne's many subsidiaries. The true scope of the billionaire's ambition became clear. Thorne wasn't just buying the topsoil to grow corn, he was systematically acquiring the land that sat directly above the deepest reaches of the Ogallala Aquifer. The documents revealed plans for massive industrial wells. Thorne was buying the water rights, the blue gold beneath the soil. In a future where water would become more valuable than oil, he was positioning himself as the ultimate gatekeeper of the regional supply. Elias realized then that the red circle on his map wasn't just about land. Desperate for help, Elias sought out the only ally he thought he had left, a local official in the zoning department who had once been a close family friend. Elias needed someone with the power to challenge the permits. But when he arrived at the municipal building, the office was eerily quiet. The desk was cleared of all personal photos, and the official's nameplate had already been removed. A clerk mentioned, without looking up, that the official had resigned that morning after receiving a private settlement. He had moved his family out of the county before the sun had even reached its peak. Elias stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the water rights document heavy in his hand. The local support system had been dismantled from the inside out. He was now isolated, a lone man standing in the path of a silent corporate machine rewriting the heartland's future 1 acre at a time. Elias stood at the back of the town's community center, a stage for a high-stakes land auction that felt more like a clinical corporate merger than a local gathering. The air was thick with a heavy predatory energy. Men in tailored navy suits sat in the front rows, their glowing tablets contrasting sharply with the worn wooden benches. These were not the farmers Elias had known for 40 years. These were the cold liquidators of a lifestyle. As the gavel fell on parcel after parcel, Elias witnessed his own community being carved into a mosaic of corporate holdings. Each sold signified the death of a family name etched into the Iowa soil for generations. It was a cold, efficient dismemberment of the heartland, performed with the sharp stroke of a digital pen. The most painful realization didn't come from the strangers, but from the faces he recognized. He caught the eye of Thomas, a man who had once helped Elias pull a tractor from the mud. Thomas looked down, his posture slumped. Elias tried to approach him, but Thomas stepped back as if Elias were a threat. It was clear. The hush money had been distributed. His lifelong friends had signed non-disclosure agreements, their silence purchased with sums that made their previous struggles look like a bad dream. They weren't neighbors anymore. They were ghosts waiting for the moving trucks. The local culture was being replaced by a silence that felt more like a burial than a business deal. Through overheard conversations of the acquisition teams, the scope of Marcus Thorne's vision crystallized. This wasn't about global hunger or modernizing the family farm. Thorne was building a private, closed-loop resource system, a sprawling fortress of sustenance for the world's elite. In a future of resource scarcity, these 500,000 acres would serve as a private breadbasket guarded by high technology. The food grown here wouldn't reach the local grocery stores. It would be sequestered for those with the wealth to buy a seat at the New World's table. Thorne was treating the Midwest like a lifeboat, and he alone was deciding who got to stay on board. The isolation deepened when Elias visited the First National Bank for a loan extension. Instead of a firm, friendly handshake, he was met with a cold, professional rejection. On the manager's desk, a Thorne Capital logo was visible. The betrayal was systemic. His own bank had been sharing Elias's private financial vulnerabilities with Thorne's team. They knew exactly how much pressure his family could take before they broke. His debt-to-income ratio and equipment liens were a roadmap for his destruction. The community's financial backbone had been replaced by the interests of the man trying to erase them from the history of the county. Nature echoed this collapse that evening. A violent storm tore across the plains, the sky turning a bruised purple. Elias stood on his porch, watching the wind whip his corn into a frenzy. The sound was like snapping bones. By dawn, his family's crop lay flattened in the mud, ruined by a force he couldn't control. It was the perfect storm of greed and nature, leaving him physically and emotionally depleted. The broken stalks mirrored his own resistance, battered and sinking into the earth. The weight of the world felt heavy as he surveyed the storm's wreckage. As a cold drizzle fell on Sunday morning, a black SUV pulled up the driveway. Thorne's lead attorney stepped out, his leather shoes caked in mud. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he produced a single thick check. The amount was staggering, enough to pay Caleb's debts and change their family's lives for 10 full generations. Mr. Thorne is a patient man, but his patience has ended, the attorney said. The offer is valid until sunset. Sign and you leave by Sunday. If you don't, we stop being polite. Elias looked at the paper, then at his ruined fields, the silence of the valley pressing in on him. Elias looked at the staggering figures written on the check, the ink still fresh and mocking the decades of sweat and blood he had poured into this Iowa dirt. The lead attorney had already vanished back into the black SUV, leaving the silence of the porch to weigh heavy on the old man's shoulders. He walked slowly back into the house, the floorboards creaking under his heavy boots like a familiar, comforting language he was desperate to preserve. In the living room, a small fire flickered in the hearth, struggling against the damp, biting morning air. Without a second thought, Elias reached out and dropped the paper into the glowing embers. He watched as the edges curled, blackened, and vanished, the promise of generational wealth turning into a single plume of gray smoke. It was a choice of legacy over liquidity, a final refusal to let a billionaire's ledger define the worth of his family's soul. The response from Thorne Capital was immediate and visceral, arriving before the sun had even reached its zenith. The quiet phase of the acquisition was officially over, replaced by a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to break his spirit. That night, the sky above the farm was no longer filled with the peaceful twinkling of the Midwestern stars. Instead, a swarm of high-altitude drones hovered in a fixed, terrifying grid, their red and green lights blinking like predatory eyes. The low, persistent hum of their rotors vibrated through the wooden walls of the farmhouse, a constant rhythmic reminder that every movement they made was being recorded and analyzed. By the next morning, the situation escalated further. The irrigation lines that Elias shared with the neighboring plots had gone completely dry. Thorne's technicians had installed massive steel gates on the communal access points overnight, citing emergency infrastructure upgrades that conveniently only affected Elias's acreage. It was a slow, mechanical strangulation, intended to starve the land until the soil itself cried out for the check Elias had already burned. In the shadow of this escalating tension, a bridge began to form where there had only been a deep emotional rift. Caleb, seeing his father's unwavering defiance and the physical toll it was taking, felt the last of his resentment dissolve into a fierce protective loyalty. He realized that the debt he had carried was a weapon Thorn had manufactured to drive a wedge between them. Late into the night, father and son sat at the heavy oak kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of yellow deeds, weathered maps, and the faint scent of old paper. Caleb's laptop glowed alongside Elias's magnifying glass as they began to dig into the farm's deep history, searching for anything the corporate lawyers might have missed in their haste to colonize the valley. Hidden within a rusted metal box that had belonged to Elias's grandfather, they discovered a forgotten legal document that had been buried under decades of tax receipts. A permanent environmental easement. Decades ago, a previous owner had designated a significant portion of the farm as a protected habitat for a rare migratory bird species. The easement strictly prohibited any industrial drilling or heavy infrastructure development on the land or its immediate surroundings in perpetuity. It was a tiny, fragile crack in Thorn's massive plan, a piece of paper that could legally block the construction of the industrial wells Thorn needed to tap into the Ogallala aquifer. Caleb, fueled by a new sense of purpose and a mastery of the digital world, used his tech skills to trace the convoluted web of shell companies Thorn used to hide his tracks. He bypassed sophisticated digital firewalls and followed a trail of dark money that led to several undisclosed environmental violations in other states where Thorn had already established his private resource hubs. They were finding the rot beneath the visionary's facade, but as they drew closer to the truth, the retaliation grew more violent. A sudden orange glow illuminated the bedroom windows in the middle of the night. Elias rushed outside to find the century-old family barn engulfed in a roaring wall of flames. The fire hissed and popped with a terrifying intensity, fueled by the dry hay and the memories stored within its ancient timber. As the structure collapsed into a heap of glowing ash, Elias didn't weep or shout. He stood tall in the middle of the yard, his silhouette framed by the dying fire, knowing that the quiet buyout had officially become a war for survival. Amidst the chaos of the fire, Caleb managed to download one final encrypted file from a server he had been monitoring. It was a secret government contract labeled Project Resource Security. The land Thorn was buying wasn't just for a private retreat. It was part of a classified federal initiative to secure food and water during an anticipated global food crisis. Elias's farm was the geographic heart of this project, the final piece of the puzzle, because it sat atop the purest part of the water supply. The stakes had transcended local politics. They were now standing in the path of a national conspiracy. The drive to the city felt like a journey through a dying empire. The transition from the scarred, blackened remains of his barn to the sterile obsidian glass towers of Thorn Capital. Elias didn't wash his truck. He left the mud and the ash from the fire caked onto the fenders as a silent witness to the war he was bringing to their doorstep. When he pulled into the corporate plaza, the security guards looked at his battered Ford as if it were a prehistoric relic. Elias ignored them, his boots echoing with a heavy thud across the polished marble floors. He was a man made of Iowa limestone and stubborn grit, walking into a temple built on digital smoke and mirrors. He didn't have an appointment, but he didn't need one. The folder tucked under his arm was a key that could unlock doors even Thorn's algorithms couldn't anticipate. In the elevator, rising 50 stories above the pavement, Elias watched the horizon disappear. When the doors opened, he was ushered into an office that felt like a cathedral dedicated to the future. Thorn sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of petrified wood, the architect of a new world. He didn't look angry about the burned barn. He looked disappointed, like a scientist whose lab rats had developed an unexpected mutation. Thorn spoke first, his voice smooth and cold. He talked about Project Resource Security not as a conspiracy, but as a mathematical necessity for a collapsing world. He argued that the old ways were a luxury the planet could no longer afford, and that by centralizing control of the soil and water, he was saving the country through brutal, data-driven efficiency. Elias listened, his hands steady as he laid the environmental easement and the decrypted files on the petrified wood. He countered Thorn's logic with the weight of 3 generations, arguing that Thorn wasn't saving the soul of the country but lobotomizing it, stripping away the stewardship that only comes from those who bleed into the dirt. The tipping point came when Elias revealed the extent of what Caleb had uncovered, the proof of the coerced sales, the predatory lending traps, and the illegal seizure of water rights. For the first time, the billionaire's polished facade flickered. Thorn didn't offer an apology. Instead, he offered a partnership. He suggested Elias could be the face of the new movement, a board member of a subsidiary that would oversee the transition of the entire county. It was a poisonous olive branch. But as Thorn leaned forward, gesturing to a digital map of the county, Elias saw the true scale of the betrayal. The map highlighted a massive network of industrial pipelines that would divert the town's entire communal water supply. The resource security wasn't for the people of Iowa. It was a resource hijack that would leave the local community to wither in a man-made drought. The realization hit Elias hard. This wasn't about farming, it was about feudalism reinvented for the digital age. As Thorne signaled for security to escort the farmer out, Elias looked at the hidden camera lens on the lapel of his jacket and then at the wall of monitors behind Thorne's desk. He simply told Thorne that while they were talking, Caleb had used the tower's own uplink to go live with the stolen data to a massive global online audience. The air in the office was thin, smelling of ozone and synthetic cologne, a stark contrast to the scent of damp earth and wood smoke Elias carried. As he stood his ground, the silence between the two men became a living thing. Thorne's eyes never left Elias's weathered face, searching for a price that hadn't been named. When Elias spoke of the water diversion, his voice didn't shake. He pointed at the map, his calloused finger tracing the path of the proposed pipelines. "You're not building a future," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "You're building a cage." The security team moved in, moving silently. But they were too late. The light on Thorne's computer began to blink a frantic red, the signal that the firewall had been breached from the inside out. The digital fortress was crumbling, and as Elias was led toward the door, he knew that the silence Thorne had spent billions to maintain had finally been broken. The silence in the obsidian tower was shattered not by a bang, but by the relentless rhythmic pinging of 1,000 alerts. Marcus Thorne's face, usually a mask of calculated indifference, finally cracked, revealing a frantic desperation as he watched his digital empire bleed out onto the open internet. Caleb's upload had been a masterstroke of digital guerrilla warfare, exposing the project resource security documents, the predatory loan structures, and the illegal water diversion maps to a global audience that was suddenly, terrifyingly attentive. Elias didn't wait for a goodbye. He walked out of the glass-walled office, his muddy boots leaving a trail of Iowa earth on the pristine white carpets, a final mark of the world Thorne had tried to erase. By the time Elias reached the ground floor, the story was already a wildfire. The federal government, pressured by a tidal wave of public outrage, moved with a speed rarely seen in the halls of power. Within days, the Department of Justice announced a sweeping investigation into Thorne Capital's land acquisitions. The quiet buyouts were hauled into the harsh light of a congressional hearing, where the secret government contracts were torn apart and the shell companies were unmasked. Anti-monopoly laws that had gathered dust for decades were suddenly being sharpened. The national narrative shifted from the inevitability of corporate efficiency to the necessity of local stewardship. The headlines screamed of a billionaire who had tried to own the very rain and soil of the heartland, and for the first time in years, the politicians were forced to listen to the people whose lives they had nearly bartered away. However, for Elias, the victory often felt like a hollow harvest. Driving back through his county, the landscape told a different story. The legal battles were won, but the people were largely gone. He passed farm after farm where the windows were boarded up and the gravel driveways were overgrown with weeds. The hush money Thorne had paid out had functioned as a one-way ticket for his neighbors, who had traded their heritage for a life of quiet regret in distant cities. The town square was a skeleton of its former self, a ghost community where the only sound was the wind whistling through empty silos and the rhythmic creak of abandoned swings. The corporate predator had been fended off, but it had already swallowed the heart of the community before Elias could strike back. It was a victory of soil, but a defeat of society. But from the ashes of the family barn, something new began to grow. Elias and Caleb stood together on the scorched earth where 3 generations of history had once been stored, and they made a solemn pact. They didn't just rebuild the barn, they built a fortress of a different kind. They established the Heartland Legacy Cooperative, an organization dedicated to the digital and legal defense of the American farmer. Caleb, once a son who wanted to flee the crushing debt of the land, became its greatest guardian. He utilized the very technology Thorne had used for extraction to instead create a transparent registry of land titles and water rights that could never be quietly manipulated again. The project slowly drew in the remaining families, creating a collective shield that made the cost of corporate encroachment too high for even the wealthiest investors to justify. They realized that the quiet buying only worked when people were isolated and afraid. By standing together, they reminded the world that the soil was not just a commodity, but a living trust. Stewardship was the only path to a sustainable future, a lesson Thorne's algorithms could never compute. As the first autumn frost began to settle on the fields, Elias stood at the edge of his 500 acres, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of violet and gold. The land was finally his again, free from the shadow of the glass tower. It was more than property, it was a home, a history, and a promise. But as he turned to walk back toward the farmhouse, the evening news on his radio flickered with a report from Nebraska. Another mysterious LLC was buying up thousands of acres of rangeland. The battle for Iowa was over, but across the vast expanse of the heartland, the quiet war was simply moving to new ground, leaving a haunting warning in the wind.